Consumption, Work, and Identity in a Globalizing World. Dr. Marquita Walker, Department of Labor Studies at IUPUI. The interconnectedness of world economies grew, and many countries in the global north moved away from a manufacturing industry to a service industry characterized by low-paying, less skilled jobs. This move resulted from the mobility of capital and labor. As we discussed in Lecture 1, comparative advantage played a huge part in moving countries, noted as producer economies, into countries noted as consumer economies. This occurs when the production of a good or a service can more efficiently be purchased from another country rather than being produced within a country. The dynamics of moving from a producer nation to a consumer nation are not without its consequences. The idea of a producer nation was tied to the human connection to production. Humans were either productive or unproductive. Producers, those who made usable goods, were thought to be scripturally sanctioned. To work was to have self-esteem, so a human relationship to a job was of primary importance to one's identity. The principles of work, adherence to scripture, and property rights were the foundation upon which a Protestant and patriarchal economic system was built. To work, attend church, and own property was considered a God-given reward, so wealth became associated with a Protestant and patriarchal lifestyle. The idea of consuming goods and services was originally thought to be a wasteful and irresponsible lifestyle. During the Industrial Revolution, goods were built to last, so the need to replace them was almost non-existent. Humans, identified by their work, were considered insolent and lazy if they consumed too many goods, and society considered them to be wasteful, indolent, and lazy. It wasn't until after World War II that the idea of consumerism in the form of replaceable goods was introduced. The cultural acceptance of disposable goods associated with self-worth signaled the advent of moving from a producer nation to a consumer nation. Consumption and identity in the workplace. As more and more workers are shifted from the manufacturing industry to a service industry, we find a proliferation of changing attitudes and behaviors within workplaces. The approach management takes when directing the workforce is predicated on Taylorist principles, which divide work actions and motions into fragmented repetitive tasks and over which workers have little control. The micro-supervision of workers leads to workplace stress and high turnover. This is more pronounced in the global south, where much outsourcing from multinational corporations in the global north occurs in call centers. Let's look at Indian call centers, for example. Indian call center personnel are often required to adopt the identity of another person in order to facilitate consumer transactions. The subsuming of one's identity and the use of scripted conversations not only impacts the worker's emotional labor, it hides from the consumer the bigger problem of outsourcing jobs from the global north, suppresses public opposition to outsourcing, and conceals the neoliberal policies which exploit global south workers. Global North and Global South relations in offshoring. Offshoring is the practice of sending a country's production of goods or services to another country to take advantage of lower labor costs, economies of scale, or to evade environmental, taxable, or regulatory policies. The practice of offshoring has gained great popularity with multinational corporations. Most of these multinational corporations have developed Western human resource management techniques which emphasize teamwork, collaboration, and communication. This one-size-fits-all approach to managing workers from various cultures leads to a workplace which is often coercive and exploitive. but it also provides a space within workplaces in which workers can respond differently to management practices based on their country of origin. German culture is different than Indian culture, is different than Mexican culture. So the resistance these workers exhibit to management practices will vary according to their cultural identities. This control resistance dichotomy exemplifies the labor process theory. Fair trade versus free trade. The idea of free trade is based on a neoliberal agenda within a capitalist economic system and suggests all barriers, such as tariffs, environmental and economic regulations, and government interventions, should be removed between world trading partners. It is based on competition and consumption. Free trade is the premise in all global trade agreements. A more nuanced approach to trade is contemporary ethical trade, in which all participants can benefit from consumption because it promotes economic empowerment to disadvantaged producers, who will then enjoy a higher standard of living because the playing field between producers and consumers is leveled. Fair trade developed as a consequence of ethical trade, or the need for fairness in transactions. The origins of fair trade emerged from the idea that all producing economies should receive equitable and ethical fairness in their economic transactions. Fairness, after all, seems like a goal that would be beneficial to all stakeholders in a transaction. Thus was born the fair trade movement. Producers who sign on to the fair trade movement promise to pursue equity and transparency in their trade deals and are licensed by the Fair Trade Foundation, a nonprofit organization, which allows those with licenses to use the Fair Trade mark on their products. Fair trade rewards smaller producers who have difficulty competing with large agribusiness. Though more research is needed to substantiate the outcomes of the fair trade movement, the position of fair trade in a global market favors multinational corporations and disadvantages producers regardless of whether they belong to the fair trade cooperative or not. Though the economic outcomes for producers is minimal, there is some social and personal empowerment for consumers who feel as if they are contributing to equity and fairness of producers. Nevertheless, while the fair trade mark found on some products may encourage global awareness and fairness and equity, multinational corporations still retain their primary goal of free trade in all markets.